The following is an AZPM original production.
From the radio studios of AZPM, welcome to the latest edition of The Press Room. I'm Steve Goldstein. Coming up, the Tucson City Council has rejected Project Blue, but could the data centers end up in southern Arizona even without Tucson's approval? Also, 3 wards held council primaries this week. Who's coming out on top? A panel of journalists joins me to discuss those stories and more next on The Press Room. Welcome to the Press Room. I'm Steve Goldstein. Our distinguished panel of journalists today: John Washington of AZ Luminaria, Dylan Smith of the Tucson Sentinel, Joe Ferguson of the Tucson Agenda, and Andrew Brown making his debut from AZPM News. Welcome. Thanks all for being here. So, John, I was on my calendar in bright red, kind of, August 19th. I thought Tucson City Council, let's look at what's going to happen August 19th with Project Blue, and they jumped ahead on August 6th with a unanimous rejection. I'd love to ask the surprise question. Did you see this being unanimous? Did you expect it to end like this on August 6th?
Well, yeah, so they voted, the city council and mayor voted yesterday at what...
on Wednesday?
Yeah, that's right. What Lane Santa Cruz called not a study session, but a turning point. And I thought that was notable. And it was, unanimous rejection of Project Blue. I think that this was gaining momentum, and it was sort of leaning more heavily this way as the weeks went by, especially after Monday night's raucous meeting. Seemed like a social referendum against Project Blue. There's a handful of supporters in one corner of the room, all wearing the same union vests, but it maybe had a little bit of the optics of plants. Otherwise, the unanimity was not only in the city council, but among the greater Tucson metropolitan area, or so it seemed.
Yeah, Joe, so considering it got this far, I don't want to say who's to blame, but I almost do want to ask it, to have gone this far. Pima County supervisors, narrow vote, and maybe at least one of the voters was having some second thoughts about that. What stood out to you about Wednesday other than the 7-0?
I think that there's a real clear disconnect between economic development right now and elected officials. I think that they're not brought in early enough in the process, and so they are being shepherded these projects that they probably would have told them 2 years ago, no, this is a bad idea. And so they are just being brought right to the end of those NDAs and said, this is the choice in front of you. You have a binary choice, yes or no. The soups barely passed it, and when it came to the city, we saw almost immediately, one by one, people speaking out against it.
Dylan, you've covered this thing for a long time. It almost felt like, and I was just watching it online, but it almost felt like there was an avalanche of sorts. Again, not to say, and John's saying there was momentum, which makes total sense to me, but it did almost feel like one council member was feeding off another council member and so on.
Well, I think in the last couple of weeks, especially as we have been able to learn more about the specifics of this proposal instead of just the broad strokes, the elected officials have been, at least some of them, publicly asking more and more pointed questions and trying to learn more themselves, things that they were not told as this kind of, negotiations proceeded under the veil of the NDA behind closed doors. And a lot of those folks didn't know very much more, or so they tell us, than members of the public and reporters were able to learn. And as things kind of, to go with a water pun, seeped out into view, people in the public became more and more concerned about this, to use like maybe the most polite term. And elected officials pay attention to voters, and especially, a broad cohort of voters. It wasn't just, a small group of progressives who were, kind of against this. It wasn't a group of NIMBYs who were just saying, oh, no, don't do this in my backyard. It was a whole lot of folks. There were even union people very publicly asking questions about the construction jobs, asking how long will these jobs last?
Right. Andrew, jump in on this. And we know you were at Monday's meeting, which we'll get to in a moment, but what about Wednesday? What stood out about for you?
I just feel like when I saw the mayor get shouted at the meeting on Monday, that I felt like there was a palpable rage in that room. That I feel like I've been in Tucson covering politics and everything here for about 19 years, and I think like maybe SB 1070 is the last time I felt this much like public outrage about a topic, and there were just a lot of different factors that I think really made people uncomfortable. And I feel like almost every single person was talking about it, almost everywhere that I went, and I just felt like it was gonna be nearly impossible for them to move forward with it. And I feel like we were talking, and you mentioned something about when the developer is disclosed, it has less of a chance of going through.
Yeah. So there was a potential threat. Maybe you could look at it as a sort of bluff that if we learn the name of the end user, the company that was going to be running this data center,
Amazon.
which, yes, we learned through public records request that it was Amazon, then they would walk. And, you know, it was notable, Kevin Dahl's response was, let them walk. And they didn't, or they certainly haven't until they got voted out. But, you know, now there's actually what seems to be potentially another bluff saying that, okay, vote us out, but we're going to build anyway somewhere else. And there's been a couple of ideas about where that somewhere else could be. I know, Joe, you've reported on the potentiality of Marana. We identified through our public records request as well 3 other sites in the Tucson region. There are 2 land sites that are owned by private developers and 1 by the state of Arizona. These could potentially be in play, but the big hang up here is where will they get the water? Where will they get the electricity? And they very likely will need some municipality to provide that.
And Joe, a big part of before Wednesday was Tuesday, the reference to Councilmember Nikki Lee putting out this idea that there's a plan B for Project Blue. I guess that shouldn't be a surprise either, but how much has that sort of tied the hands of elected officials in the sense that, okay, Project Blue's got some power, they might just do an end around?
Well, I think that, I think there's a lot of people that are skeptical now. We've had Project Blue mislead us once before. They said that their name comes out, they're walking. They didn't walk. They said that, this is their only plan. Now there's a plan B. I have some strong concerns that this is still a bluff. The amount of water that they need and they need to pump in the AMA, the only non-exempt entity is Tucson Water. If they can't get it through that, they're going to have to go through a very long, very strenuous process that is likely to take years if they get it in the first place. And that's not on their timeline. Their timeline is to be opened in a year and a half. And so I have some considerable doubts that we are going to see a plan B come to fruition.
The Project Blue folks have told us, for weeks that they had 2 other sites in the works, in addition to the one we know the location of that Pima County agreed to sell them. There was supposedly the second site inside the Tucson city limits, where they would have access to Tucson water, infrastructure-wise, everything would be there. They could hook up to drinking water. And a third site where they've been very, very mum about, just somewhere in the Tucson metropolitan area, they tell us. But they were very, very keen on getting this one site approved. Like the whole package seems to depend on whether this first one works or not.
I think it's worth noting here that the 5 of us are sitting in this room, all of whom have been very close observers of this process for the past month or months, and we're speculating. We don't know. And, there are people who know. There are people in the city and in the county who know, and we've been able to eke some information out of them. I think back to the old aphorism, knowledge is virtue. If you're going to decide whether or not this is a provident or improvident decision to go forward with this mega project, you need to understand what it is. And the slow leak of information is one of the primary reasons that we saw such fury in the public, that they were not only upset with the actual potential end product, but they were very upset with the process. And that was something that actually got mentioned in City Council study session Wednesday. They were actually pointing the finger at the Board of Supervisors, who took a potentially, too quick vote on this to sell the land.
Well, the City Council, or the city at least, was involved with this just as much as the county right from the start. About the information, things have been so closely held that elected officials and top folks in certain governments have not known, like say, that it was Amazon Web Services. plenty of people could probably make an informed guess. I think most of us made that informed guess before we even saw it in writing, right? But, this was very carefully managed to try and keep information away from people.
Yeah. So to go back to the word fury, the phrase palpable rage, Andrew, you were involved in the Monday meeting. You were there shooting some tape, and I want to give our viewers and listeners a chance to hear and see that.
Over the last how many years, maybe decades, we've been told that the Colorado is drying up. We've been told that our water future is uncertain. We've been told to turn the water off while we're brushing our teeth. And so to see suddenly that we have all this water for sale is pretty infuriating, I think, to most citizens.
There's no doubt this is about water. Reclaimed water is our future drinking water. We're already recharging it, and we're going to give 6% of it away to one company for 180 jobs.
We have other choices as a city to use our reclaimed water that are not this, which is another in a long history of bad development decisions for Tucson and Tucsonans. Thank you.
Why did seemingly only a few people in the higher ups of Tucson know about it for 2 years when the community's only known about it for like 2 months?
Electricity, we don't have the grids for it. I live in the foothills. My power went out for over 2 hours last week. No storm or anything, where infrastructure is older. And so the cost of putting something like this online is just unbelievable.
Andrew, let me go back to what you were saying about the feeling that there was an influence that really affected people. I want to have all of you weigh in on that a little bit. Are elected officials starting to listen more, or is this something that, as you said, if you're comparing this to SB 1070, obviously people were angry about this?
I just think that people live in Tucson because they really like Tucson, and they don't want it to be like every other place. And I think that, I was really thinking a lot about what it was in the Tucson Agenda, the Steve Christie quote that he said the economic malaise that we're globally known for in Pima County. And I do think that there's like competing interests here, but I just think that Tucson doesn't want to do what every other place like Phoenix and Las Vegas are doing, building these data centers. People really care about the water here. People really care about the land. I live in the Dunbar Spring neighborhood, and there's like integrated rainwater harvesting and all of these like really grassroots community efforts to make Tucson its own unique place. And I just really feel like that was on display at the meeting.
I think that's such a fascinating point, Dylan. Let me go to you on that, because but there's a certain quality of life, a certain way of life that folks who live in Tucson, and there are some who, based on Project Blue, and maybe they were on one side of the issue, and based on the Steve Christie quote that Joe got, can this be maintained? Or, I think globally known for might be a little bit of an overstatement, but is there a concern? Where's this economic development going to come from?
Well, that's kind of two questions in one,
okay.
But real quick.
I'm very good at that. I like four.
One on specifically about water. For a couple of generations now, the city of Tucson, through government efforts, has taught residents of this community to be very careful and respectful and conservative in our use of water. And we have been. This town uses less water than we did 30-something years ago, even though there are way more people living here. We have changed how we live. People gotten rid of their pools. People have ripped out their lawns, gone with xeriscaping, be more careful about what kind of plants are in their yards. So, yeah, people have been instructed by the government to be very passionate and involved in taking care of our water. About jobs and the economic development in general. Yeah, we live in a poor community, right?
Do you remember Pete the Beak?
Exactly.
Pete the Beak says beat the peak.
Yes.
The spokesduck for Tucson Water, a very popular ad campaign from the 90s. I love looking at those old ads.
The only thing I will say cynically, just to say skeptically, as the guy who parachutes in from Phoenix and has lived there for 40 years, Phoenix has said the same thing. We're using less water than we did in the 1950s, and there aren't that many people in Phoenix who are happy to get rid of their lawn or get rid of their trees. So that's why I wonder just about the people in Tucson are, I think, much more conscious on that level of saying, I want to maintain this, because Phoenix has so many transients, so many people from across the country. And yet, can Tucson somehow blend technology with jobs while also doing a pretty good job of saying we're responsible here?
Well, that has become part of our community identity. On the economic front, we are still, unfortunately, a poor community, and I think we all need to recognize that. And we need more good, high-paying jobs. This project wasn't going to bring in jobs. They were saying, oh, there will be 200 people working there. We've all seen how that does not happen in every single economic project that the government brings to us. The commitment was for 75 jobs, but these places don't even take 75 people to run. Yeah. They take maybe a dozen.
I just think that there was a lot of promises, but the contracts that bound them was much different. It was a vast divide between them. And I think that, the unions came to those meetings and they were labeled as proxies, but I really think that they were making their best case to say, work with us, give us that PLA. Let us know that we're here and, we want to work with you, because they want those jobs. And as we talk about economic development, 290 acres, that'd build a lot of homes. That'd employ a lot of carpenters. That'd employ a lot of other union members if we had turned that property into a massive development.
You're right to point out that there's a big difference between a promise and a contract. There's also a big difference between a contract and reality. So, at the Monday night meeting, one of the developers actually said that in his experience, the lifetime of a data center like this might be 15 years. That's not very long, actually. And we don't know what the technology is going to be like in a year or two. So things could change dramatically, and how much is it going to keep bringing in? We don't actually know what the future is going to hold.
I kept thinking, what are they going to do with it when it ages out? Are they going to turn it into more pickleball courts? Like, how many more of those can we have in Tucson? Plenty more. Yeah.
They're going to launch it into space, according to Nikki Lee. So
one other thing I want to bring up, John, let me go to you first on this one. There was a little bit of what I would characterize as throwing under the bus of certain city staffers. Like, why didn't you guys tell us about this earlier? And they made us look like fools, and we're the ones voting to some extent or not. Is that going to lead to staffing changes? Is that going to actually lead to a different way of economic development?
I think that there's absolutely some public-facing pressure. What goes on behind closed doors remains to be seen. And what has gone on behind closed doors is still not completely revealed. So were they, in cahoots? And now when they saw the public backlash, they say, okay, now we need to take a different sort of public stance on this. We know that from these records that we got, we know that both city and including some city electeds, we know that the county was talking about this for at least 2 years. Mm-hmm. So now that they see that, okay, Tucson has, the public of Tucson has firmly rejected this, I think a lot of them have sort of feel like the tails between their legs right now. On the county side, they're trying to sort of post hoc put in some regulations, undo some tax exemptions. On the city side, they're, I think you're right, saying sort of throwing under the bus some of the officials, non-elected officials. But I think there will be some policy changes at least.
Well, and I think you've got 2 or maybe even 3 new members of the city council coming in.
Right.
They're progressive. They're replacing people that are more moderate. And so, I think that they're going to have their own voting bloc and their own ideals. And so they might look at NDAs and economic development in a very different lens.
I think that Tuesday night was a factor as well. We saw the mayor get on stage at the Democratic primary watch party. And, she was responding to 2 people who are very progressive, who just got elected. And she said, we are hearing you, Tucson, that you want us to push a progressive agenda. And that doesn't exactly accord with, welcoming in Amazon.
Yeah, and I have to admit, now we know what kind of city Tucson is, and it has worked, I think, mostly pretty well for residents, but we'll see how that continues to go forward. In any way, does this end up, as we watch the council going forward with new members, is there any chance this actually then does a loop around and we end up doing whiplash and we're actually going to try to go a little bit more to the right? Is there any possibility about that?
of the city moving to the right,
or even Pima County.
Well, especially not with the people. I mean, we have one. Basically, we know who's going to win one of these wards in November because no one else is going to be on the ballot.
Yeah.
The other two are, very, very likely to win in a Democratic majority city. Are they going to move to the right? No. They may become a little bit more skeptical and maybe push for more open processes, less going on under the guise of NDAs, and having more info come out earlier so that they know and so that the public can provide them with some feedback. The most kind view of this is that we had some folks in local economic development and in elected office who were looking for a big win. And in some ways, this would have been, it would have brought in a lot of property tax money, and that really would have helped, especially Pima County's budget. But at what cost otherwise?
So very different issues, but John, you look eager, so I'll jump to you on this one. So these are obviously extremely different, but Project Blue, Prop 414, what are we supposed to read about the way these two things have gone? Does that say anything about the future of Tucson, short-term future, economic future, job future?
Well, I'll start by trying to answer your last question and maybe get there. That was a big one there.
Yes.
We're no soothsayers. We're reporters. We report on what's happening now or what's recently happened. And something that recently elected, rather recently won the primary, Miranda Schubert said to me on Tuesday night, said, people caution me against being too progressive, but she won handily. And so, pendulums swing politically, certainly. But right now, I think reading the leaves on, in our cup right now, I think that Tucson remains maybe increasingly progressive at the moment. And maybe actually Project Blue has galvanized some of that progressivism. What it says to 414, I'm going to hand over to Andrew.
No, again, I feel like we have some work to do as a community, because what kind of jobs can we get here? What kind of industries can we grow? I think that when we were talking about Project Blue, I understand that we do have, Steve Christie does have a point, and I think that it can't just be this place for progressive retirees. We need to invest in the future, and I think that we have to figure out what that is going to look like. And again, we're just reporters. I don't have the answers, but I feel like that's something that we really need to have a really serious discussion about as a community.
Joe?
I just wonder if we are looking at Prop 414 as not being progressive enough for voters.
Right.
I think that, a lot of people rejected it for the sales tax and some of the things we heard, but I think there were a lot of voters that stayed home or didn't vote for it because it wasn't progressive enough. And so I think that I've been calling it Prop 415 because here I was talking about another one next year. I think you're going to see a very different version if it comes to the voters.
With that proposition, it may have even passed if it had been more conservative. But they tried to put together a mixed bag of stuff to give everybody something to vote for. And just in the tenor of the times, it gave everybody something to vote against. Everybody could find something they didn't like in there. Steve, you mentioned that a lot of this community is working well for a lot of people. And yeah, for quite a few folks, but there are many people in this community where things are not working very well. They're working lousy jobs for low pay, live in, not great housing. There is a lot of work to be done in improving the lives of a significant portion of our residents of Tucson.
I think that's why I asked the now ironic question related to does this lead to a slightly more moderate group of elected officials, because from the standpoint of maybe there are people who really want Tucson to be more progressive, but they may say maybe this isn't working as well as we'd like it to. Maybe people are not getting the respect, the opportunity, and maybe if we were a little more moderate. I'm not saying that's the case. I just wonder.
I think sometimes the pressures of being in elected office and actually having to be responsible for the decisions and eventually being held responsible at the polls is a kind of moderating influence. You can campaign on slogans, you can campaign on grand ideas to change the entire world and provide everybody with a supply of free unicorns on a daily basis, but that turns out to actually be very tough.
Yeah,
being in charge is hard. Yeah. And I've been thinking a lot about this too. Like, it's just I wonder how many, like, this data center. There's a movie called Eddington that John and I both saw. It's about building a data center in the desert. I really do think that there's just this enormous consolidation of wealth and power in our country, and I think that as we continue to see that happen, I just feel like you're going to see more and more progressive ideas, because I think people are, in their own way, pushing back against that. Yeah. And I do think that this is a really good indication of the spirit of Tucson. And I also just want to shout out the fact that, you and Yana doing the reporting, John and Yana doing the reporting for Arizona Luminaria, disclosing that it was Amazon behind it, might have put been another nail in the coffin for this. So, like, young man, what do you have to say for yourself? Like, potentially ending a multi-billion-dollar.
About 30 seconds, and don't blush too much.
Yeah. Well, I think that Tucson really stepped up and made their voice heard by City Council, and maybe retroactively by the Board of Supervisors. But also, all of us sitting in this room did a lot of reporting and really scrutinized and had to pull out as much information as we could from sometimes officials or contracts or whatever was trying to be kept locked behind closed doors. I think it shows the need for good service public journalism right now.
Okay, absolutely. Great. Yeah, great work by all of you. Joe Ferguson, Tucson Agenda, Dylan Smith of the Tucson Sentinel, John Washington of AZ Luminaria, Andrew Brown, a great debut from AZPM News. Thank you. Thank you all.
I survived.
Yes, thank you all for being on the Press Room. Thanks very much for joining us for this edition of Press Room. We are back next week with another episode. I'm Steve Goldstein. Thanks for watching the Press Room here on YouTube. If you have a question about something we talked about, please leave a comment below. And for more Press Room, click right here.